Yeah, we're going to start. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and welcome to another in our series of seminars in the i4energy series. Let me make a few announcements first before I introduce our distinguished speaker today. First of all, thank you to the California Institute for Energy and Environment for supporting these meetings. We are very grateful for all of your support, and especially for today's lovely lunch. Secondly, welcome to those who are out on the web and viewing this seminar from the internet. We hope that you enjoy it. We have the option of sending in questions by instant message, and I think that's on the website. So if you have a question, please send it in. My name is Gary Baldwin. I am the Director of Special Projects in Citrus for Energy and Environment and the Managing Director for i4energy. And along with my colleague, Gaiman Yi, who is sitting in the front row here, the Technical Director of i4energy, it's our pleasure to welcome you today. We are very, very pleased to have Professor John Zysman speak to us today on the topic of energy systems transition, the VC model, energy policy, and the climate. I have known John for several years now and had the pleasure of working with him on many projects, some leading up to the COP15 meeting in Copenhagen and others since then. And I have to say, it's both personally and professionally a great pleasure to still be working with John. John received his BA at Harvard and his PhD at MIT, and he has written extensively on European and Japanese policy and corporate strategy. His interests include comparative politics, Western European politics, and political economy. I'd just like to mention a couple of his more notable books, and he's written extensively. One is called Manufacturing Matters, The Myth of the Post-Industrial Economy, and how revolutionary was the digital revolution, national responses, market transitions, and global technology. John has been involved with technology and innovation for a few years now. He's still young in his career, as you can see, but he's been involved with technology for a few years with the Semiconductor Industry Association and others. This is a special favor by John to the i4energy series. This was sort of a last-minute, I don't want to use the word substitute because we're very honored to have you here today, John, but a last-minute change in plan from the speaker that we had originally scheduled for this slot. We did change the agenda on the web, so you may not be that confused. And he is building on a lecture that he gave to a group of venture capitalists from New England who visited here last semester. And so, John, we're very happy to have you here today. We look forward to your comments, and let's give John a very warm welcome. Thank you so much.
I'm trying to turn this on. Is this on? Do I really need it?
You do. You do because of the web.
Oh, right.
There, it's on now.
Thank you for the introduction, Gary. And I should say that I had failed.
It's on and really on. So let's move this down. There we go.
We'll try again. I actually failed. You see, I told Gary I'd do a talk this semester, but I didn't give him a date. And by doing that, I thought, they'd fill up the program and nobody'd ask me to do this. So I failed in my basic strategy here by being a substitute at the last minute. I want to make a couple of comments. I'm not an engineer or a physical scientist, and I was drawn into the energy discussions, as Gary has suggested, by collaborating with Citrus's work with the Copenhagen Climate Council. I've, as he says, spent a long career looking at national technology and economic strategies, both in electronics and in finance as well, and now in foreign policy and in climate. And this issue really has, over the last years, begun to engage me. And before I begin, I want to actually thank two of my fabulous graduate students who've really been teaching me what I need to know on this. Mark Huberti, who is to his benefit in class and therefore doesn't have to listen to this again, and who is working on energy systems transitions, and I'm drawing on his work, as well as Nina Kelsey, who's working on the international climate negotiations aspects of this, and I want to thank them for all that they've been teaching me. When I put this together, I decided I wanted to make some comments on clean tech finance, on energy policy, and on climate negotiations. And what I think is important is that at the core of all of these discussions, the financing of clean tech, the energy policy debates, the climate negotiations, is that they're all ultimately about a transition in energy systems. And energy systems transitions have happened historically. They're not simple, they're not quick, and the problem is we're all in a hurry. So the issue here becomes, what are the implications of that for the choices we have to make going forward? So as I say, looking at these three problems as one problem in energy systems transformation complicates matters. The VC model is complicated because the targets for investment become less clear. Energy policy becomes complicated because one has to identify the policy levers not just to accomplish narrow objectives, but to really achieve this basic system shift from a high-carbon, low-efficiency system to a low-carbon, high-efficiency system. And climate negotiations become complicated because they tend to focus on the outcome we want rather than the process we actually need to achieve it, which is we need to move into this new energy system. And if we focus on, as I'm going to suggest, on emissions, then in fact at times the logic of the negotiations become difficult. Emissions are clearly the scorecard. Whether or not they're the appropriate policy instrument is a separate and different question. Now, the way into this issue of whether or not this is what the nature and difficulty of a system change is, I'm going to really draw on this notion of what are the implications for the VC model of a clean tech era. And the question then becomes, what must the VC community do to make sure that it prospers in a clean tech era? Is there anything different in the VC story from previous decades? Now, we all know that story, so I'm not going to belabor it. For outsiders, sometimes one needs to do that. But the venture capital logic is about new technologies, new firms, and new markets. And in our part of the world, its core features are about finance, about taking risk, about the networks in the community that allows people to coordinate and collaborate in building projects, and in the technology flows and the flows of technology oftentimes out of the community. The venture capital model, from the time it was really generated in this part of the world, has endured a long history. There have been a sequence of technologies. We go from the original semiconductor on through much newer products. There have been a sequence of innovation platforms running from, if you will, the original mainframe on through the PC, on through into now into networked platforms that now are culminating in cloud computing. And in a sense, it's really been driven by and encouraged, if you will, by the emergence of open modular production, the emergence of supply networks, and of globalization with borders. Now, why does that latter matter? Basically, these sequence of technologies have created an endless set of spots where investors could, in fact, take targets, make bets, and the breaking up, the decomposition of the production system globally, the de-verticalization of companies, in fact, has the consequence of opening up more and more kinds of targets. If it's an integrated company, if IBM's an integrated company and it's producing everything from the semiconductor on through the final mainframe product, there really isn't room for a venture company to sort of intrude into that kind of marketplace. So the decomposition of production, which has been a basic feature of the electronics industries over the last years, spreading into other sectors, really opened the way for the venture community to succeed. Now, the question becomes obvious, which is this VC model going to endure in the clean tech era? On the surface, one would think, why not? The clean tech, the drive toward clean tech opens up a whole basketful of new opportunities. It would seem that would really be the great choice. Therefore, there's this new place where VC companies can invest. And so a whole array of companies, from Kleiner Perkins to Vinod Khosla's firm to Vantage Point Venture Partners, raise billions of dollars to try and invest. But is that the whole story, or has the game really changed? And here what I want to suggest is that the venture model has changed. There are an array of critical new issues. The first, and I think the most important, is that there's no longer a set of clear targets. There's a diversity of technologies, a diversity of directions where firms can go. Do you invest in wind technology? It's not just do you invest in semiconductor technology with different variants on it, or invest in computer technologies with different variants on that, but in fact, which of a series of technology domains do you make, in which of those domains do you make a bet? Which trajectory do you think is really going to be the successful trajectory? That's a very different model of investment than the one we've seen in the past. Do you bet on biofuels? Well, think of all the kinds of policy choices that are essential if biofuels is going to become crucial. It's not just a technology bet. In fact, as many companies like to say, the venture people tend to make bets on the technologies, and hedge funds and others tend to make bets on the implementability of existing projects. In this case, that choice really is not so simple. It's really not so clear that you can make the straightforward traditional technology bets. The second, of course, is that the scale of the bets goes way up. And in fact, the venture model really has been a portfolio of small and middle-sized kinds of bets that, in fact, if you lost a few, weren't so crucial. If you want to go build a real solar thermal facility, you're starting to talk about real money. So the question is, you can't really just build a small prototype in a laboratory. You're going to have to really invest tens and, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars. That's a different kind of financing mechanism. And in fact, we now hear talk that what we're seeing is a shift from a VC model to a hedge fund or private equity kind of model of financing of clean technology. And that is an important element, but the most important element for me is, in fact, that the energy revolution is really a system shift. And I want to talk a little bit about that and what it means. System shifts are distinct from other kinds of technology movements. If you look at sort of the history of technology and you look at the literature on technology, there's a long discussion about what are marginal improvements in technology and what are basic shifts in paradigm, if you will. And basic shifts in paradigm are both much more radical in their consequences and much more difficult to accomplish. So a system shift is not just an improvement of a component, not just greater density on a chip or the change of an input. It is, in many cases, a fundamental shift in where you're going. Equally important, any of these basic system shifts, and by the nature of the word system, it means not standalone element, in fact implies the development of sets of complementary technologies. If you don't have the array of complementary technologies, your own technology bet really can't succeed. So if you want to invest in renewables, what other kinds of technologies do you in fact require? Do you require a smart grid? Do you require storage? And how do you make your bets if, in fact, those other complementary technologies are not easily available? The electric car clearly requires charging stations. If you don't have a set of charging stations, how, in fact, do you get that done? So the question in all of these cases for a VC is that you can't just make the narrow bet anymore. You, in fact, have to really start to think about how do we build out the complementary technologies. I remember at the first of the technology mitigation meetings we held in Copenhagen, when Shai Agassi from Better Place was, in fact, talking about his project, I was standing with Jim Rogers, who some of you know is the CEO of Duke Energy, and I said, well, that's a huge increase in electrical demand if that really generalized. Can you do it? And he said, yes, if we have smart grids and storage. No, if we don't. So it was really quite interesting because the Shai Agassi model can work in a narrow way in a few places, but it can't be generalized easily unless you do the larger set of build-out of complementary technologies. And the complementary technologies in the case of a smart grid isn't a small decision. It's not something that just a few other companies can do and bring you along. Now, equally important to that is if you're looking at a system shift, do venture companies, do firms actually optimize in the old system, or do they optimize in a new system? When we first started looking at a number of these issues, I remember the arguments we used to have of should people invest in improving internal combustion engines. Okay, well, that's in a sense an optimization in a liquid fossil fuel model. If you're really trying to move into the other, you don't want to put more money necessarily, except as an interim step perhaps, into improving internal combustion engines. You may want to put your bet and your money into batteries. Okay, and if you don't make those choices, there isn't an infinite supply of money to invest in everything all at once. So the question is, do companies make their bets inside the old system, or do they make their bets inside the new system? When you tip from one system to the other, let's say, once you really are in a low-carbon, a smart grid with storage kind of system, we could imagine that the marketplace will drive an enormous number of these kinds of investments. But until that happens, people are likely to continue to see the opportunities in the older system. And that's all the more important, and I emphasize this issue because of the whole reality of lock-ins and the way in which prior investments in an old system shape the choices at any given moment. Some of us are old enough to remember the early debates on trying to increase fuel efficiency in cars, and one of the crucial ways of doing that at the time was to reduce the weight of the cars. One of the big elements in the weight of the car is an engine, and big iron engines are very heavy. So the question was, how did you do that? At the time, 30-some years ago, almost 40 years ago, many people thought that the way of doing that was, in fact, to substitute aluminum engines for iron engines. Of course, the difficulty is that I had an aluminum engine in a sports car, and it tended to, shall we say, not function properly. I was a graduate student. I shouldn't admit this, but I took 2 federally insured student loans and bought an Alpha Spider. So I called it the federally insured student Alpha, right? In any case, I ultimately sold it to, not a junk dealer, but to my mechanic. But in fact, the problem is that people knew less about aluminum than they did about iron. So ultimately, it proved easier to reduce the weight of iron engines than it was to increase the reliability and stability of aluminum. So in a sense, people were still optimizing inside of this old paradigm of using that kind of engine. And this, if you look at a shift in something like into a low-carbon environment, that is just played out over and over and over. People know a lot about internal combustion engines. We know a lot less about certain kinds of battery technologies. So the question is, where do you make the bets? The short-term bets are always going to look easier inside of the older system. Now, I emphasize that because for the information technology industries, they got a free ride. And the reason I say they got a free ride is much of the shift that was required from one system to another sort of happened without their having to do anything. In a sense, they jumped into the middle of that. The ICT revolution, the microelectronics, and the Internet played into shifts that were already underway. If you look at the microelectronics revolution, on the one hand, it was at least initially possible to imagine that it was a direct substitution of silicon for tubes, oversimplified. Equally important, many of the existing players, because in fact, the existing players who have a stake in the old technologies, in many cases aren't going to exactly go along with the policy changes that are required to get to a new world. We only have to look at coal companies and oil companies as we start to think about the clean tech era. So that in fact, in this case, the 2 big players, AT&T, who had a stake in this and knew a lot about the technology, AT&T and IBM were formally by law, or at least by anticipation of the law, blocked from being players in the microelectronics era as merchant semiconductor players. Why is that? AT&T, as we all know, was a regulated monopoly. It was not able to, in fact, try and take its position and become a merchant seller of the various products it was producing for itself. And then it was being broken up by law, or I should say by judicial ruling and later by law. And IBM took one look at what was going on with AT&T and said, they'll do that to us if we start cross-leveraging our position from one marketplace to another. That left open the room, both in the market and in a certain sense in the political market, for a few small companies to start a semiconductor revolution. Intel, AMD, National Semiconductor. I do remember, because they were small companies initially, and they really were startups. I remember when a friend of mine actually was a treasurer at one of the major companies in San Francisco. We were having lunch, and he had said with great pride that he was not going to sit on the board of this new company that, in fact, had asked him to be on its board because it was somewhat beneath him, right, because it wasn't significant enough. The company was Intel, right? So, this guy did well for himself. He sort of did derivatives before there were derivatives, meaning it was a company that had lots of cash, and he basically knew how to manage it in the kind of way that people who later built derivatives. So he made a fortune all by himself. But it was interesting that this fellow just couldn't see this possibility. He would have been glad to sit on the board of AT&T or the board of IBM, and he was the category of person who might have been asked. But Intel was sort of that. So the space was there for these companies to try and succeed. So established players were limited in their ability to block change. And equally important, as I've suggested, in the ICT revolution, the decomposition of production, the emergence of supply networks, began to mean that companies would buy from outsiders in a way that had really not been true in the past. The same thing is true with the Internet. I mean, in a real sense, the Internet as a commercial consumer operation as opposed to data networks that companies were using sort of emerged partly because you could grow it out, at least in the public mind, over dial-up networks. You didn't have to, in fact, change the underlying structure. Now, how did other countries that sort of took one look at this and said, okay, the Internet is really something that matters, how do we make that shift from one world to another, from one system to another? Well, in other countries, who had different kinds of rules about dial-up, where you couldn't really build out the Internet over the dial-up network in quite the same kind of way, in other countries, the government really did step in and force the construction of high-speed data networks. In Korea, for example, the government chose to use the funds it was getting from the auctions for the wireless networks to subsidize the build-out of high-speed networks in major cities. Okay, it was a conscious choice to sort of force that shift from into a new technology domain. Now, the clean tech shift is a system shift as well. It's a shift from, as we've said, all of us know, from a high-carbon, low-efficiency environment to a low-carbon, high-efficiency environment. And apart from the fact that it involves different kinds of sources of technology, different ways of using the technology, different ways of transmitting the technology, in some sense we're also pushing uphill because we have a perfectly good electrical system that could well be improved, but what we're really trying to do is not just improve it, which is sort of optimizing in the old system, but improve it in a way in which one element of that system is in fact altered, which is the degree of carbon emissions. And one might also say the degree of import of petroleum, but that's a separate conversation. Because many of these technologies, at least initially, are going to be more expensive. So the question is, how do you tempt people into supporting this kind of system change if, in fact, they have to be, if you will, pushing uphill? So the question at that point becomes maybe the market's not going to quite do that. Now, what we would say then is that if we maybe can get some historical guidance. For this is not the first energy shift, okay? And the work, as I said at the beginning, of Mark Huberti, who's been working on this, and it's actually on the Citrus website, the paper. It's really quite good, and I commend it to you. And I say it's quite good. I think it's both an excellent academic paper, and I sent it to the CEO of one of the major American energy companies who sent me back a note saying he was compelling all of his senior people to read it. So, but in fact, I think the issue here is that if you look from wood to coal, the move into oil or into electricity, each were radical system shifts. And the move from wood to coal, happened pretty quickly. It took a century and a half. And in fact, it required, crucially, the emergence of railroads, which were both possible because of the coal, but until you had really a railroad system or a prototype system in place, you couldn't really do that. Why? Well, because the wood system was, trees grew lots of places in England. Coal was in a few places. So either you had to move the industry that was emerging to where the sources of energy were, or in fact you had to move the coal to where you wanted to use it. And in a similar kind of way, as the transport began to become better, you couldn't sort of burn coal in the same kind of furnaces or the same kind of heating systems in a home. You had to come up with entire new sets of ways of approaching the uses of energy. In oil, I would simply say that there was a transport system issue as well. It was called the oil pipelines, and of course, that's where Nelson Rockefeller made his fortune, was by capturing those pipelines. And in that shift, the electricity story is unusual in that, in fact, much of the entire system was, at least initially, for some purposes, in the head of one man. Edison, who actually did understand that this was a system and that you couldn't just generate electricity, you had to build out this entire system, and he went and found both financial support and public policy support for engineering and politically and technically engineering that system. So the conclusion from that is, of course, that system shifts require complementary technologies. And now the question is, what are the crucial complementary technologies in this era? I should put a question mark here, but do renewables require a new grid? In fact, do electric cars require fueling stations? And if that's the case, how do we get the local Chevron station on the corner to, in fact, I say Chevron because near me the closest gas station is a Chevron station, to not only give me the choice of pulling in and filling up my tank with gas, but in fact recharging the batteries as well. Without that kind of system, it becomes sort of a specialty luxury good. So if the problem for the VC world is exactly where do you put the money in what is in fact now a diversity of possible directions, not all of which will succeed at the same pace, and which commercially, to be successful, really require the complementary technologies to be in place, better place, or any electric car company is going to, or Tesla is going to, in fact, be a limited player unless there are ways of, in fact, refueling the vehicles. Renewables will reach an upper limit in some ways unless we have ways of really using them effectively. So that takes us then to the policy problem, and suddenly for the VC community, they have to play a policy game in order to make the system shift happen this time. As I say, the previous couple times with microelectronics and the internet, they were able to ride a transformation that was already underway in the character of the system. But this time through, they are going to have to help, in a real sense, make it happen. So the policy problem then becomes one of driving the transformation. And the policy problem becomes, where are the levers? I mean, what are the levers, if you want to pull, that in fact mean that in fact you start to encourage companies to optimize in this new energy world? If there's a need for complementary technologies, how do you encourage that before it's obvious that there's a market for them? You need them, but you don't necessarily have a market for them. What role is there for government? Will prices in the market suffice? Well, what's implied here, of course, is not necessarily. If you go back and look at the wood story for a minute, you'll discover that at various points the British government intervened. And sometimes it was concerned that if you chop down too many trees, there wouldn't be enough trees left to build all the ships that they needed to run the empire. So the glass making at a crucial moment, that was essentially the royal licenses required that you use coal. Okay, so that there started to be a notion that you had to push this shift, that you had to push this transformation. So will market suffice? Is purposive government-directed action required? All of that changes the policy plan. It's not just a matter of should we support wind or should we support solar. It is how do we pull off that system. And that becomes even more difficult because, in fact, politics and policy, certainly in this country, is subject to the fights over the multiple objectives. One clear objective, of course, is price stability and supply security. Notice I say price stability, because in some ways the problem is not just whether prices are high or low, because it is an interesting question of how the Europeans and the Japanese pull off the politics of, in fact, having very high prices for petroleum products. But in fact, it's the variability in a lot of those prices that continuously creates problems. And supply security. In fact, some ways the renewables sort of address that problem, but in fact that's a constant theme in policymaking. The objective of carbon constraints is obviously the new issue, one that concerns this discussion. And of course for companies, whether it be PG&E or it be Duke Energy, the question is how do you get a return on capital? How do you in fact take care of your customers at the same time that you in fact are getting a return on capital? So there are really multiple sets of objectives, and the politics over the current energy bill reflect that. I mean, that's really what the core problem is. So that's why I think that at times, in a sense, sort of saying we're going to just raise the price of carbon, because that's clearly the current debate. Everything is about that. Should we just tax the increase in price of carbon? Should we get an increase in the price of carbon by, in fact, having a cap-and-trade system? When, in fact, I think the crucial issue is also what are the things that need to be in place to make this transition happen, to tip us from one system into another. Now, many people, and I certainly work that's going on at Citrus and elsewhere, sort of look at this and say, well, can we roadmap the future? Can we, in fact, identify the levers and try and identify technology choices? Gary Baldwin, who was speaking before, Kostas Spanos in engineering, Shankar Sastry and Julie Stein, we've been working at the question of how you go about doing that. That's something we could really talk about. Can we identify what those levers are, what the priority items actually are in making this shift? And notice that I emphasize here the notion of domains. That is, do you invest in internal combustion engines, or do you invest in batteries? What are the domains that you really want to go after? Once we've decided which domain we want to be investing in, we can start looking at a technical, detailed roadmap. But until we do that, that's not so clear. And an operational road mapping is not just something that happens at a university. It is a matter of how do you get the companies together to start saying, well, if I do X and you do Y, by this date 2 years from now, we actually can put them together into a new kind of system. And therefore, I think as we think about how to do that, we have to think about why a carbon roadmap differs from the SIA roadmap. As some of you know, the Semiconductor Industry Association has been very successful in having a roadmap that, in fact, has contributed to maintaining this notion of Moore's Law. And the reason is that there's both a technical analysis and there are a set of companies that sit down and say, okay, if you do X and I do Y, in 18 months we will both have the complementary products required to take this next jump. But think how much easier the SIA problem is than this energy problem. You have one oversimplified, you have one technical objective. Let's increase the number of transistors in a given bit of space of silicon, okay? That's one technical objective. An enormous array of other things follow out of that. They just come out of that once you've accomplished that in the industry as a whole. Here, there's 4,000 different crucial objectives, and it's difficult to identify which ones those are. So that the road mapping problem is important, but quite a bit more difficult. And I think, in a certain sense, more political, because many of the choices will be which of those domains are emphasized. So that then leads, if the policy problem is complicated in that way, that leads us then to the nature of the climate negotiations as a system shift. Now, many people have seen the Copenhagen as a failure, and I actually don't agree with that. I actually think it was an enormous success. Why? First of all, you know, many of you have been following the energy issues for a long time, so this is, for you, frustrating that, in fact, greater progress wasn't made. But if you look back 4 years ago, this wasn't an issue. I mean, and what COP15 really did do was really drive home the fact this was a crucial question. It took a large step toward getting this onto the permanent political agenda in a whole array of countries. And I don't think we should underestimate how significant that actually was. The fact that some of the bargains we wanted didn't necessarily emerge from it is, I think, unfortunate perhaps, but this was a huge success. Secondly, I think it was useful in that it showed the limits of the current negotiating strategies, something that Nina has been emphasizing. There's a real problem with the focus on emissions as the negotiating target. Why is that? I think there are two reasons. One is that it puts an enormous emphasis on winners and losers. So it sets up this conversation. You, the rich countries, have created all these problems. You fix them. You fix them at home, and you pay us to make sure that they don't emerge in our countries, because you are the problem. Okay, so that the minute you sort of say we're about these targeted emissions, that's what the negotiation became, and it shouldn't surprise anybody that it actually went in that direction. The second is, if you sort of target emissions, it's sort of like saying, look, you're a little overweight, and therefore you need to lose 15 pounds. You say, okay, how? What should I stop eating? What should I do? Because setting those targets doesn't necessarily create an actual roadmap. What it does is say, okay, we're going to actually have a cap and trade system, which is back to this idea that if you simply raise the price of carbon, everything will work out in the marketplace. Okay? But if, in fact, as I'm suggesting, this is a system shift, and that, in fact, you can get a system shift in the market, but like the move from wood to coal took a century and a half, and arguably we don't have a century and a half. So if you want to get that system shift, then maybe just raising the price of carbon isn't the solution. And if you want to sort of go to a country, whether it be India or China or Vietnam, and say, you've got to start addressing the problems of how you're producing carbon, you better have some answers, about, well, you can do this and you can do that and you can do the other thing. So that, in fact, I think what's happened is what came out of Copenhagen was the fragmentation of the negotiation into an array of different negotiations. Well, maybe that was the right thing in the first place. Maybe what we really need to be doing is saying, what are the choices we need to make this systems transition? And importantly, I should say that in the United States, there's a debate emerging now about how serious is the global warming problem. In the United States, I think I would turn that on its head, because for many of the global warming skeptics, the argument that I often now like to make is, look, if everybody else believes that this transition is going to take place, if the Chinese, the Indians, the Europeans are all going to massively invest in it, that transition is going to ultimately happen. And when it does, if we've not participated in it, in fact, we will ultimately be losers as the great changes in application of technology occur over the next while. So the question is, we need to, in some sense, as part of the negotiations, convince each other and everyone else that that transition is going to happen, and you better get on board, because not only a matter of who should pay, but it will be, if you don't play, you lose. I think the change in the focus of conversation is important. So that's why I say the energy systems focus reframes the conversation. There's one other issue that I sort of skipped over. I wanted to make this remark, and I think it's in this issue of the choice of domains and the choice of multiple objectives. So let me, since we're in a university and not in a corporate audience, let me just sort of make this remark, particularly in an engineering community. There's often a tendency in engineering communities to think that there's a single best answer to a problem. And in this case, the question is that a lot of times we're going to have to figure out what the politically appropriate answer is. Let me give you what for me is the classic example in this, which is that when I started graduate school, there was a famous case. The mayor of Grenoble, France, had been elected, though he didn't have much power because the French administrative system has power. But the mayor of Grenoble had been elected. He was an engineer, and he'd been elected on a platform which basically said, there's one best way of collecting garbage. Okay? We technocrats know what to do. And of course the question was, that's true if we could decide whose garbage got collected. And did we have, who got benefited? Do we collect everybody's garbage equally? Do we collect some kinds of garbage? Do we charge extra for it? What is the character of the nature of the garbage collecting regime, if you will, that we want to have? So that in this whole story, an enormous array of these problems are not simply technical. They, in fact, really ultimately are political. And I think that becomes very important because we really are in a new era of negotiations. And we're in a new era because, as Nina would emphasize, the countries like China and India, let me put it this way. For 40 years after World War II, 50 years after World War II, America and Europe were the dominant players, and they could sort of bring others into international deals on the economy by basically offering access to their markets, principally the American market. You want to play, we'll open our market to you. You just behave politically in the ways we like, and you can sell some more stuff to us. Now, we've seen some of the consequences of that, but that is basically what we did. So we had a huge negotiating instrument. Suddenly, that's not the game. Now the game is, you don't do what we say, we'll keep polluting. What are you going to do? How are you going to stop us? So, the question becomes, the power shifts from the buyer, in a sense, to the seller. And in fact, we see this, in a sense, as a shift in the way these economic negotiations are going to take place. And in a real sense, it's the first flexing of Chinese power. The Chinese have really been, if you will, not able to exercise their military power. There's nowhere to do it. They've not really been willing to exercise their economic power because if they sort of tipped the American dollar into collapse, all of their own assets would evaporate. So suddenly there is this situation where China can say, and other countries can say, we're indispensable too. You can't play the games you want to play. You can't conduct you can't go forward in the economy in the way you want unless we are major players in that story. And that was one of the things I took away from I went to COP15 because there were some other things going on. Never go to an international negotiation to go to the negotiation unless you're part of the negotiating team. Because, you'll basically see a lot of restaurants and you'll see a lot of lines. So, in fact, I had some other things to do that were going on because the negotiations were taking place there. But what I sort of took away from those conversations was, in fact, the reality that, it wasn't just the energy system world was different, but the global political economy was going to be different after COP15 as well. So with that, thanks very much.
Thank you, John, very much for a very stimulating talk. I have to confess, this is probably the second time that I've heard this talk, and I always learn something new when I hear it. So I hope that you all did as well. And we are now open for a few minutes of questions. And my colleague Gaiman and I will wander around the room with these portable microphones to help the... You have a question, Gaiman? No. To help those on the web hear the question as well. So we have one back there.
Oh, thanks for an excellent talk. And I've worked in the VC world on both sides of the fence, on the company and the fund side. And what I pick up from the talk matches one of my own beliefs in this area, is that if we are concerned that the developing world also follows a low-carbon pathway, then there are a number of gaps in the VC model that are likely to cause a failure of the systems change you're talking about. In particular, for example, if you're based more than a couple of hundred miles from Sand Hill Road, if your market earns $3 a day, and if your technology has been published or is in some other way unprotectable, you're not going to get it VC funded. So the kind of innovations we need in the developing world are not going to get the VC model of funding. So I'm interested in your comments on that area. And I should say I have some bias. We're working on a non-profit that's addressing some of those gaps. But I'm interested in whether you see those gaps as well.
Well, the first thing is yes. I could almost end there. I'm curious which non-profit you're with.
Just starting, you wouldn't have seen it.
Okay. Absolutely, and I think that part of the question will be that, and I didn't add this, I probably should emphasize that one of the other problems with the VC world is that we can invent all the technology we want here at Berkeley, at the junior college on the peninsula that's called Stanford. You know, and it's Leyland's Stanford Junior, right? So I always think of it as the junior college. But in any case, we can invent the technology, but the classic problem of which a number of us wrote about years ago, you can't control what you can't produce. You know, you can start the technology, but the build-outs of the energy systems in China and elsewhere are going to be where the mastery of those technologies really develops. So that, in fact, the real question we will have is not just whether or not a few VCs have invested, but whether or not, as the technology is built out, real competitors emerge by moving around even the intellectual property that the original VC company actually had. So I think that the understanding how these models are going to build out in the emerging markets is actually essential to the success of the VCs. I didn't put that in the talk, and I actually thought about it, and I forgot to. So thank you for asking the question.
Seems to be that the carbon emission becoming a roadblock stuck in the Copenhagen negotiation. So you mentioned that the smart grid maybe is the key for that. Is the Copenhagen negotiation can be a vehicle for us for different countries, including the United States, for the smart grid? And so I'm trying to relate your last bullet with some of another bullet you have earlier in the slide.
Well, the first thing is I'm not an engineer, so I make absolutely no claim to know where the appropriate levers are. It just strikes me from what things I've heard that the smart grid is obviously one of those crucial elements. So that it seems to me that one of the things that starts to become important is if one can identify and get a broad agreement on what are the crucial levers, it may be possible to get governments to start investing in those areas. But we have to start building, if you will, a roadmap that sort of says if you do X, you can accomplish Y, and start trying to think in those directions. I think the beginnings, I thought that if Copenhagen could be seen as a success, as a step toward building those pathways, then in fact I think maybe it would be it's useful. If in fact it's just seen as a failure of the emissions agreements, then I think it won't lead that way.
I'd like to bring up the N-word, nuclear.
Did you want to add to the to
well,
that? I'm happy.
It's something that didn't come up at all in the talk in terms of energy transition. It's certainly the major thrust of the Chinese energy transition, where it seems to me to be the elephant in the living room that nobody wants to mention.
That's you're absolutely right. The question, maybe I'm trying to avoid answering this. I don't think so, though. There are two ways of looking at it, really. One, or three. One is it's a disaster. The second is it's the solution. And the third is it's buying time. The question is and I just don't know enough about nuclear technology. I mean, to know whether or not you can build enough plants fast enough, whether they're safe, whether the material can be stored reasonably safely. I mean, I see the issues without claiming any expertise in knowing the answers. My own instinct is that, in fact, it is part of a bridge between here and there, whether we like it or not. And so that would be just my own instinct. I have not seen arguments, even from nuclear proponents, that argue that it is, in fact, a long-term, full solution.
In terms of thousands of years?
In terms of 20, 30 years, even. Sorry?
Oh, there's several hundred years worth of uranium deposits that have already been found.
They're absolutely sources of uranium. The question is whether you can build the plants, manage them, and so forth that fast. And there's a debate quite apart from the somewhat ideological and somewhat environmental debate about whether or not nuclear power is a good thing or a bad thing. I hear mixed arguments even amongst those who want to extend it. about how viable and how large a chunk of the energy market it could actually take if it was turned loose.
I'm just wondering, like, besides the sort of obvious magic bullet changing policy, this top-down approach, I'm just wondering whether there are any sort of, do you see any possibility of any bottom-up approach, like some sort of disruptive technology, like what happened to the flash disk compared with the older, the cassette disk, that kind of external memory storage, that kind of analogy. Do you see, is that possible at all to have that kind of technology disruptive, like not really costly, is that costly as what you said, a systematic big change, like evolution almost? Do you see any sort of that kind of a small change?
Well, again, I don't want to sort of assert where I might, I don't want to express technical judgments. Let me characterize the storage technology which you're really talking about. All of that was inside of the emerging computer paradigm. Okay, those were all, one way or another, they were significant innovations. They weren't just marginal innovations, but they were significant innovations within an existing paradigm. So that, in fact, the emergence of the computer is, in the first place, is the radical shift in how things are, and how information is managed, the movement of information to digital form, the ability to start to apply digitized information in a variety of domains. That's the revolution. This is a piece of it. So the question is the move between high carbon and low carbon the equivalent of that? And I would treat the parallel to something like the different forms of storage technology that you're referring to as somewhat the equivalent of one piece or another of what's going on with wind technology or solar technology and the like, that they're elements or components of one piece of a system shift. They are expensive. That's right. So the question becomes, you know, the cassette didn't matter except the shift had already taken place, you know, and therefore how do you move to a system where you can use alternate sources? Do you see, let's put it this way, does anyone see radical alternatives that are not at this point really being talked about?
Let's do one more question here, and then we'll have to cut this off. Please.
Yeah, I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit about the interactions between government and private investors in light of the transition problem where it's not just a roadmap but a sequencing question. Like, we might not want the electric vehicles until we decarbonize the grid, until we're able to charge off peak and so forth. So it's not just one innovation but a set of innovations that need to happen in a certain sequence. Is there any kind of precedent for government-led private investment that would produce these kind of results 10, 20, 30 years down the road?
You know, you said government-led in that kind of way, and so I'm not sure I want to call it government-led. The question is, are there interventions that may be possible or might be necessary where we can look at some of the crucial levers that won't happen fast enough unless in a pure market environment, okay? So I would phrase it in that kind of way. You know, if we sort of go back to the whole role of nuclear technology, if you take have there been radical changes in the sources of energy in energy systems in different countries? Well, as we know, the Danes have moved very significantly toward reducing the use of petroleum through high taxes on things like cars, through the subsidies to wind technologies, through a whole array of mechanisms of heating that are radically different. The French have done that through nuclear, right? Where I think it's 70% of the French electrical power comes out of nuclear power. So I think we can say that, you know, that government action can accomplish certain things. If you go through the risks of inappropriate government action, I would agree with them. There's the old metaphor that, you know, that governments can act in small windows when they have the least information because the system hasn't really started to gel. So it's the points at which they have the greatest leverage is the point at which anyone is open to the greatest number of mistakes. So if you looked at this as the way a VC might, or a portfolio of investment, they don't get to have a portfolio of investments, right? they have to make one or another kind of bet in that way. But I think the sequencing issue, I think, is absolutely right. I think some of the benefits of things like Tesla or Better Place is starting to suggest that if you get a decarbonized grid in that way, you can start, that other transport solutions are possible. Because you partly have to convince people they're there before they're willing to start down that transition. So I have no magic bullets, unfortunately.
And with that, we will thank John again for a very good talk. John, thank you so much for stepping in at the last minute like this.